So I hope you all have taken the opportunity to look at the short screencast that I made on the tragedy of the Commons. I had mentioned last week that I thought that the chapter on corporate social responsibility and business ethics was a natural and a great transition into our discussion about economics, particularly when we consider what sustainability is, which in the natural resource world, we typically will talk about things like the society, the environment, and the economy. To translate that to the business world, remember I introduced the concept of the triple bottom line, which is people, planet, and profit. But that notion of sustainability is meeting present needs of today's population without compromising the need for the future generations. So that screencast that I presented, it was a little bit different presentation, and I think a better presentation actually than what I have here for the tragedy of the Commons. So I would really encourage you to go and look at that, and I've posted the essay on under readings on Blackboard too, which you don't have to read the whole tragedy. Well, you don't have to read any of it, but there's a section in there, it's a page and a half or something, that I would encourage you to read as before or while even after you've done this chapter, because when we look at what the definition of economics is, the choices that people and governments make, and there's scarce resources, the tragedy of the Commons really speaks to that, and overpopulation. And I don't take a side on it. I'm try to be. I obviously have an opinion on it, but my presentation of it tries to be very agnostic. But I did want to take just a little bit and just talk about this chapter on economics. So basically, we're looking at economics from the micro, the study of small economic units such as individuals or consumers, and business. That would be on the micro level, and from the macro level of how economics affects the overall economy and how we set policies and how it affects our standard of living. So on the micro side, you'll hear things like supply and demand, and on the macro side, you'll hear things like gross domestic product, consumer price index, those kinds of things. But the economics is considered to be a social science, and it's very complicated because while it's very numerically driven, it's also very people driven. It's a fascinating area of study. So I already said microeconomics is an individual's economic activity and choice, and that determines price of goods, the amounts of goods sold, the exchange that happens between the buyer and the seller will affect demand and supply. So two important concepts in microeconomics are demand and supply. So the demand refers to the willingness and the ability of buyers to purchase goods at different prices, so that's on the consumer side, and the supply refers to the amount of goods and services at different prices, which that would be on the manufacturer or the supplier side. So there's a law of demand, if you will, that says when the price goes up, the quantity demanded goes down, right? People don't want to pay when prices are going up. The demand is going to go different. It's going to go down. On the slide, I have a link out to Investopia that explains that a little bit more fully. So factors that drive demand, the curve will show you that the product of the buyers will change at different prices, that it's driven, however, not just by simply how much I'm going to have to pay for it, but a number of other factors that are going on in the world that kind of influence those purchases. The supply side, the law of supply, is when a producer is getting paid more they're more likely to produce, right? If you're going to get paid more for your product, then you're going to want to produce more goods and service. So the production plays a central role in determining the overall supply. In the 80s, we heard Ronald Reagan believed in supply side economics, which basically meant if you produce it, then the consumer, will trickle down, and the consumer will buy more, and that will help the economy. So the supply curve shows the relationship between different prices and quantities sellers will offer for sale. I don't go a lot into this. There's one small question on the test about supply and demand curve. If you take econ or political economy, you'll probably look at that a little bit more. But so that's fine. We look at demand, and we look at supply as two separate things, but they're not. They very much work in tandem together. So where you may have your demand curve going like this and your supply curve going like that, where those two things interact is what we call market equilibrium or equilibrium. So things will come into balance where people will pay and suppliers will produce, and at that point where those things intersect, we experience what is known as market equilibrium. In my presentation slides, I threw in a presentation for that was out of the Juneau Empire quite some time ago about the USDA buying back $13 million in canned pink salmon from the state of Alaska through its food program to help people who like food banks and those things across the state. It's from the Farm Act. I would encourage you to take a look at that, particularly those of you that aren't from Alaska or may not be natural resource bent and may not realize the impact on the economy that Alaska not only has for the state, but what it has for the nation as a whole. Obviously, we're a natural resource based economy here, and fisheries is our most important natural resource based economy in terms of dollars. Well, I guess you could argue oil is, but maybe I'm a little biased there. So anyways, take some time and look over that article. So then we moved into macroeconomics, which is a study of the overall economic issues that are affecting the nation. And here we have things that influenced by politics, by social and legal environments, and of course, this what is occurring in the United States is a little bit different than what's occurring perhaps in Europe. Speaking of Europe, our system is, and we discussed this earlier, is private enterprise system or capitalism, where you have other countries that have planned economies such as socialism or communism, although communism seems to be less and less these days, or some systems that use some of both of those elements, particularly socialism and capitalism. And we definitely have, while we're still considered a capitalist free market, free enterprise economy, we definitely have elements of socialism in our economic model. You think about healthcare and education and a lot of that. So basically, it's where the government's saying these things are too big and too important. So the only way that we can really make these things happen adequately and fairly is through the government taking control. And if you remember back in the first chapter when we talked about Adam Smith and the invisible hand and his Wealth of Nations, says the less you have government in there, the better off it's going to be, because the free markets and capitalism will prevail. So those that have a good model and can compete are the ones that are going to succeed, and the ones that aren't going to. Kind of sounds a little bit of like survival of the fittest. So I won't go through all the different types of competition that's there in your slides, but there are 4 different types of competition within the free market system, within the capitalist system. Then the forms of planned economies, like I said, is socialism and communism. Communism came out of the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx, which, the government has total central control over everything, and everybody is supposedly equal, and it's very militaristic. And socialism, as opposed to socialism, which you see in a lot of European countries and other places around the world, believe that major industries are too important if just left in the hands of the individual, that the government will allow some things to be privatized, but by and large there's a lot of government involvement and consequently a lot of taxes on people. And then the combination of those two is what would be called mixed market economies. So let's talk a little bit more on this macro side of how we evaluate economic performance. In the United States, a very good barometer, if you will, of economic performance is unemployment. How low is the unemployment? Right now we are in definite economic prosperity. We've had months or years now of our GDP being over 3%, gross domestic product being over 3%. We've had near historic low unemployment rates, so we're really prospering as a nation. But businesses do go through cycles, and so we have prosperity, which we have now. We could go back to 2009 when we had the Great Recession or the Little Depression, where we had 3 out of 4 quarters where we had negative GDP. So it could be prosperous, and then you go into a recession, and recessions are normal and a natural part of it. You can Wikipedia it up or Google it up and see how many recessions and depressions there's been throughout the years. Far less depressions, which depressions are basically 4 quarters of a recession. That's why we called it the Little Depression or the Great Recession in 2009, because we had 2 quarters of negative growth, a quarter of growth, and then a negative quarter of growth. So it depends on who you talk to how that's looked at. But if you prolong recessions, lead to a depression. Gross domestic product is going to look at the overall health of the economy. So we have I don't know what the exact latest figure is, but somewhere around $16 trillion of GDP, and so if you divide that by the number of our citizenry, we would be somewhere around each person about $55,000–$60,000. China's not far behind us, but the problem is they have 1 billion people in population, so their per capita GDP is only like $7,000 or $8,000 per person, so it's considerably less, just because of going back to that whole notion of population. So we talked business cycle, gross domestic product. We measure our price level changes through what's known as a consumer price index, and it's like a market basket of goods. So think of all the products that you buy, and basically what it does in the saying is that if you paid this much for it today, and then a year later you paid, say I bought a pack of gum for $1 today, and next year I bought a pack of gum for $1.10, the index there would be 0.1, and we would have experienced a consumer price of increase from $1 to $1.10. Okay, so often that's used to look at things such as inflation or the rising cost of consumer demand or of products that consumers want. And the chapter went briefly over different types of employment, or unemployment I should say. So unemployment, by the way, is only gauged on people that are actively looking for a job. So if you're not looking for a job, you're not considered unemployment. You're not in these figures. So we have things like cyclical, seasonal, fractional unemployment, which in Alaska we experience a lot of seasonal unemployment. One second, my whole thing went away there. Because our fisheries, people follow different fisheries around. They fish salmon in the summertime they fish halibut and maybe in the spring, or they fish shrimp they go shrimping in southeast in the summer, or whenever it is they have it. So we have a lot of cyclical or seasonal, unemployment. Fractional unemployment are people like if you were just getting ready to graduate from college and you were looking for a job, that would be fractional unemployment. Structural unemployment is when you have been automated out of a job, and that's been we've been hearing quite a bit about that lately. Don't want to pay that $15 minimum wage at McDonald's. We'll have a machine do it. New York, they're proposing a tax on automation. So if people bring in automation, they're going to tax them. So and then we have cyclical unemployment, which often happens in the corporate world, white collar. Maybe a company's downsizing and they lay their employees off. I think that's about all I'm going to cover on this chapter. I would encourage you to click on the last slide, slide 46, the U.S. debt clock, and it's got all kinds of tons of information it's very interesting on there. So I appreciate you taking time to look at this video. This now concludes our first part, and next week we'll be moving into the second part, which will be more the entrepreneurship, small business ownership part of the course. Thanks, and have a great weekend.